If you've got a herniated disc in your lower back like this or this, then the most important thing to understand is your spine has lost its ability to bear load effectively to the point at which it's become injured. And one of the most important skills, attributes that you need to develop as part of your recovery process is the ability for that spine to safely and effectively bear load again. And using simple exercises, we can really help at all stages in the recovery of a herniated disc, the recovery, rehabilitation, and restoration of stability in that lumbar spine. In today's video, we're going to show you exactly how to do that with one simple exercise. If you're new here, I'm Michael Fatika, the lead osteopath and spine specialist here at Back in Shape. We help people around the UK and all over the world fix their back pain from home and get back in shape for the long term. And today's video on the hip hinge is going to help you, whether you're in excruciating pain right now and can barely move around the house, or whether you've made some significant progress in your back pain rehab, the sciatica, the back pain that you had is starting to abate, and you want to continue to build strength and resilience safely in the lower back. We're going to go through 7 steps or levels of the hip hinge exercise, so there'll be something for absolutely every one of you watching this video, and we'll also cover some important tips to help you make sure that you're getting it right and avoiding the most common errors that make this stuff in the disc worse. First and foremost, let's understand the hip hinge itself, and we'll use the spine to do this. When you're standing nice and tall, one of the most important things you should have in the neutral position, upright, is a nice smooth backward bending curve. This is called the lordosis in the lumbar spine. It's the arch, the hollow, and too many of us spend too much time rounding and flattening out like so, this lordosis, which puts more pressure on those discs, particularly at L4-5 and L5-S1. You will not get through a day effectively without having some element of bending or need to go from high to low and vice versa. And if we're performing the hip hinge correctly, we're using our core musculature to stabilize this position in the lumbar spine. And by the way, the core muscles is not just your abs, your transverse abdominis, your obliques, it's also the back musculature as well. And that's holding things nice and steady. And then our hip joint here is the hinge. We move at the hips. The hip joint right in here, this ball and socket, is the thing that is moving, while stability maintains throughout the lumbar spine. Think of this very much like a drawbridge. You slowly lower the lumbar spine and bring it back up again, as opposed to rounding the lower back, craning over like some sort of fishing rod, which is one of the reasons so many of us either injure the back in the first place or constantly get flare-ups, because we're not mindful of this movement. And quite frankly, some of us can't actually do it very well at all. And for some of you that think you're never going to lift again with your back, or you should not do any form of lifting, try and get through a day without having stress and strain on your lumbar spine. You'll notice that level 1 of this exercise is with no weight. It's just carrying your own body weight, which none of you, no matter how good or bad your back is, can avoid. And most of you, well, if not most, all of you will go through some point, whether it's that you've got young children, you've got grandchildren, you've got family members, you've got a pet. You're going to have some exposure to load, and you're going to have to, at some point, be picking things up off the ground. You've got a choice, especially if you've got a bad back, but even if you don't, you can either learn how to effectively move to minimize the risk of unfavorable loading on that lower back, particularly L4-5 and L5-S1, or you can roll the dice every time with no awareness and coordination of how you're moving and leave things to chance. So for those of you that have been on the fence about doing any sort of lifting or hip hinging or bending, understand you've got to learn how to do it, because you're not going to reasonably be able to avoid the necessity to do it on a daily basis. It's worth understanding. Like I mentioned earlier, some of you aren't actually going to be very good at this exercise, and therefore it's going to take a bit of trial and error, a bit of learning. And we do have other dedicated tutorials on the hip hinge itself over on the website. But please know that you're not expected to get this correct first time, nor should you start at level 7. You start at level 1, you experiment safely, you perhaps record yourself, and you use some of the tips I'm about to discuss to make sure you're giving yourself every chance of success, and use some of the additional pointers as we're going through those early levels to make sure that you're not being silly and setting yourself up for failure. Remember, a child will never learn to walk without toppling, without losing their balance, without perhaps falling over. But we don't say, hold up, that's not for you. And the same for your back. You're not going to get through a day, as I've already mentioned, without having to do some element of moving from high to low with your body. We may as well learn to do it effectively because we are doing it every day anyway. So tip number one is to use some tape. And this is ordinary tape, nothing special. You probably already got it lying around the house. If not, you can buy it very inexpensively off Amazon and get it shipped right to your door so you don't even have to leave the house. And what we're going to be doing with this tape is to stick it along the lumbar spine. We're going to find the two little bony bits on the base of the spine. Your trousers will sit around about here. And you're going to come up about 1 centimeter and stick the tape along here with you stood in good posture. Ideally, you'd have someone else help you do this. You're then going to try and perform the hip hinge, whichever level that you're coming in at. You can also do this around the house and just stick the tape on your back and do a few things around the house, nothing particular, and see how it affects you. We do have a dedicated tutorial on how to do the tape test in more detail, and you can check that out, link down in the description. But what this is helping you learn is that position of the lumbar spine. When we've injured a joint, the very receptors that tell the brain where the body is in time and space are not necessarily in the best condition. And it's frequent when we're examining patients in clinic or going through videos for members on the program that people aren't aware that they're making these mistakes and they're losing that composure in the lower back as they go through the hip hinge. The tape is an external way of you feeling something, having a greater awareness, starting to restore the connection between your brain and your lower back. And what you'll notice, especially if you've got a volunteer to help you, is that as you go and lose the composure, make a mistake in the hip hinge, which is bad, by the way, you'll feel that the tape pulls off your skin a little bit. You might see, if you're the observer, you might see some of the wrinkles that were in the tape as it folded over your skin folds, you might see those flatten out. And that is a cue that you're not quite doing it correctly, and you need to work a little bit harder to stabilize the spine. And that's where the next tip comes in. The chest pop is a position that we can adopt, a good posture, a chest out position that helps you get the engagement of the back musculature alongside the core. And what we do here is we imagine just where the logo is on my t-shirt, the bottom part of the breastbone. You imagine that's being pulled up in that sort of direction towards the ceiling in front of you. You're not arching backwards, as many will do, but you're lifting up and forwards. And as you do that, you'll feel your rib cage come up, you'll feel your core tighten if you're combining this with a core engagement, and you'll feel your back muscles all engage. This helps create that brace and support and reinforce that drawbridge as you go to perform the hip hinge. You might well also feel a little bit of tension in the lumbar spine, especially as you get towards the end of range. And this is simply because your lower back muscles are working to maintain that stability against the stiffness or end of range of your hamstrings. And that's all perfectly normal, but it does freak some people out. And so long as you can validate, for example, through the tape test, that you're not losing form in the lower back, that you're not rounding that lumbar spine during this movement, then you're A-OK to continue on. We always try and educate our members and patients alongside the exercises they're doing, because understanding why you're doing something is vitally important, because sometimes it's difficult and you need to know that it's worthwhile. And understanding that the hip hinge and your competence at this movement is going to help you in 3 key ways. But first and foremost, it's going to be working on all the muscles that you need for good spine health. It's going to stimulate the spine in later stages as well. But very first, in the first moments that you're learning and getting better at this exercise, you will improve competence, which means that you are going to reduce the frequency with which you are aggravating the lumbar spine on a daily basis, the frequency with which you are going like that and therefore aggravating these little herniated discs down the bottom in your lumbar spine, be it L4-5, L5-S1, or both. In the medium term, you're going to find that as you strengthen a little bit the musculature, we're not strengthening the spine just yet, but the musculature with competent form, you're going to be able to return to more of the things that you weren't able to do. A lot of people with back pain, they start retreating from life. They start, I can't do that, can't go there, can't come out and meet you for coffee because of my back. And as you start to gain confidence, your capacity to protect that back through daily movements becomes ever greater. And therefore, it gives you that new lease on life. You can start to introduce other things. Granted, you can't get into things too much, but you will find that you can start to do some of the things that you couldn't do. Long term, however, is where you are literally going to use load, like we're going to do in some of the latter stages of these levels of hip hinge, to literally strengthen the very tissues of the spine that are injured, that are recovering, to arguably, in some cases, make them stronger than they were before you injured the back. And unfortunately, the vast majority of people, quite frankly, before they've injured their back, did not have good back health. So it's very, very reasonable. For many of you, you might well be stronger than you've ever been before if you do this stuff properly and give your body enough time. And ultimately, The stronger your back gets and its ability to bear load, as those discs that are injured in the spine itself and the ligaments around the spine remodel and get stronger and more capable, we have an exercise that is a surrogate for strengthening the spine. It's a movement that you can do in a controlled environment with all of the variables controlled, so that you can safely, steadily apply more load to the spine with more advanced versions of this movement. And no, everybody starts everywhere, but everybody can move forwards through these progressions. Ultimately, that's going to massively reduce the risk of future injuries, future flare-ups, future re-injuries of that disc, other discs, and other sections of your back. Not to mention the fact that it's going to improve the health of the musculature far beyond the lower back itself. The very first level of the hip hinge is going to be accessible to absolutely everyone. You might be standing in pain, but this is going to help you. And remember, you can use any of the tips that we previously discussed, such as the tape, to help you with these. And this is a simple bodyweight hip hinge. And all we're going to be doing here is having our hands on our thighs and running our hands down like so as far as we can go. And what we should notice is when we get to the bottom part of the hip hinge, we feel our hamstrings tighten, they won't go any further, and our back muscles tighten slightly. If our back muscles don't tighten, as our hamstrings stop us moving any further forwards, our back will just buckle and allow us to round the back. And you can see what's happened here is obviously not going to be very good. So some of you might feel that that's actually really worrying, you don't want to be in that position, and therefore have a chair in front of you. Maybe it's a dining table chair. Maybe we've got this nice and close like so, and I'm just going to not necessarily have my hands on my thighs, but I'm having them in front of me, and I just do exactly the same thing. But here, even if I get stuck, I can catch myself, I can slowly lower myself down, and I can stand back up again if I've moved a little bit too far. Understand, the lower that you go, the more chance you're going to have of losing that composure. Some of you will be a lot more flexible than I am and will be able to get your back over more to the flat position. But you've got to remember, we're looking through these levels of a pain-free variation that we can do, or rather an aggravation-free variation that we can do. And having the chair there, a dining table chair, a table, something to give you that confidence can really help you start this movement. Play around with, you've got your feet shoulder width apart, and we're just slowly going down, feeling the end point, coming back up, down, feeling the end point, coming back up, down, feeling the end point, coming back up. And it's worth mentioning, in the exercise library, there are full variations or full videos, demonstrations of all of these exercises that you can follow along with for 10 repetitions. So I won't go through too many reps here, just for the length of the video. The next thing we're going to do is using a resistance band. The reason we're using a resistance band first is because the resistance band has a variable resistance. And this makes things a little bit safer or more accessible in a conservative way than just going straight over to weights, because as we go lower using the band, the strength of the band decreases slightly. So you can have a band like so. I've got this one hooked up to a handle, and I would suggest, depending on the length of your band, you're going to be limited a little bit. But what we want to do is pop our feet through the middle of the band here, and then ideally we would grab hold of the handle and bring it up to the goblet position or the chest position, so we're nice and tall. This allows you to actually do a bit of a chest pop at the same time, and you'll see the band itself is on quite a lot of tension in this position. It feels stronger, and if you're doing this right now, you'll feel the difference. As we slowly go down through the hip hinge, it's a little bit lighter at the bottom and a little bit stronger at the top, and this allows us to start to make that first step into adding resistance to the movement when we're ready. And we'll test this out just like we did with the very first variation to see if we can do pain-free or aggravation-free repetitions. Of course, if your band isn't perhaps this long, we can hold it lower down like so, but just remember the weight of the band is going to vary a lot, and we don't want to be at the bottom of the repetition with the band slack. That's kind of a waste of time. We want to make sure there is tension throughout the entirety of the movement on the band. So often you'll need to adjust your foot position slightly to make sure that the band stays on tension. So one of the additional reasons that we use the goblet hold first, and we're going to transition into the goblet hold with a weight in a moment, is because it creates this artificial limit. For a lot of you, the arms and the hands will actually be limiting factors in the rate at which you progress. If you were to hold the weight down here, as we'll see a little bit later, it's easier for the upper body to bear that load or hold onto it. And so you can artificially sometimes move faster if we're holding the weight down here immediately. And that can sometimes trip people up, especially those of you that maybe have a background in training, you've worked out in the past. Your biggest failure, the biggest source of the relapses, and you'll probably have experienced this already, is that you went back into the gym and you scaled the weights back up again and boom, the back pain came back, because we forget that our muscles and the memory that they have of the weights we've used before will love that new training again. They're going to adapt really, really quickly. And our back, on the other hand, and the ligaments around the disc and the ligaments of the disc change much more slowly, and they simply can't keep up. So this is one hack, if you will, of artificially pumping the brakes on the speed at which you progress. So the goblet hold for this next variation or level is going to be super simple. We take our kettlebell. The same can be done, of course, with a dumbbell, where we hold it like so, and we really staple it to our chest. I'll try not to knock the microphone as I'm doing this, but we're going to hold it nice and high, nice and strong with our arms, holding onto it. We've got that chest pop in. We're popping our chest up and out. Core is nice and tight. And then we're dropping through that hip hinge, down and back up again, down and back up again, down and back up again. And make sure as we're doing these, we avoid the temptation, the common mistake, especially later on, of as we come up, pushing the hips through and arching the back. This is unnecessary. It's only going to serve to jar the lumbosacral junction, which is the last joint in your lower back, between the green and the orange down here. And it is a common movement that people do, which really, quite frankly, has no value to the movement. It only comes with risk. Naturally, we're going to get to the point where the high hold is just going to mean that our arms are losing. We're giving out. We're not able to hold the weight up there anymore. And so we're going to transition onto a low hold. This can be done with kettlebells, or it can be done with dumbbells. And I'm going to show you now. And there's an extra kind of hack, if you will, on this one to help some of you, again, that either need to use larger dumbbells. Maybe it's your gym has a particular style of dumbbells, perhaps like these here, that are a bit longer than they otherwise could be. Or it could be that you've got a bit more flexibility and you need to allow for that range of motion. So when we're doing the low hold, we're simply going to stack our dumbbell end on end like so, and then approach it very similar to how we might do a wider stance deadlift later on. And what we're going to do, pop it here. It should always be directly between our arch. It should not be forward of us, so we're going to hurt ourselves, quite frankly. We should be in alignment with it, and it's going straight up and straight down. Some people find it helpful to think about rolling paint down the front of your shins when you're doing this. That's kind of why we started you out with your hands on your thighs, so that they don't start navigating over here, which will strain you in an unfavorable way. And what we do is we can often do a little squat to get down to pick it up. Okay, so we position ourselves correctly, squat down, pick it up. So you're holding it like so, okay, between your legs. Try and chest pop out. Don't let this round you over. This is very bad, okay? Chest pop out, still, slightly wider legs, and then reach down and up, down and up, down and up. And then when we've finished, very important, we squat down like so. Remember, the exercise finishes once the weights are back in their place. It doesn't finish when you finish the last rep. So always be careful putting the weights back. Now, the extra tip on this one, to give yourself a bit of clearance, is sometimes you can use either steps or some plates so that you have a little bit more space to go low. For some of you, you will need to use this so that you've got that extra elevation, so you've got room and not banging into the floor each time. Now we're at level 5, and we're moving on to the positioning of the barbell. There's a couple of important tips with this, so people make silly mistakes. Whether you're doing the next 3 levels, whichever one you're doing, make sure you set up on the rack like I've got over here, because the rack means that I can put the weights on without having the friction that happens on the floor. Too many people are loading up their bars on the floor, and it's a workout in of itself. Your back's rounded over, you're trying to pull the weights. It really creates trouble. The second thing that we want to do is when we're doing the hip hinge, we want to take a double underhand grip. This double underhand helps you do the chest pop and get into what's called the anatomical position, rather than taking overhand grip or a split grip where you're kind of a bit skew with. I often find, especially for recovering from back pain, this double underhand grip is the best one. So when we're doing our hip hinges, we've got everything engaged with that chest pop. You can see hopefully from the side, as we do the chest pop, we're up and out, up and out, up and out, and we're in, and then we slowly slide them down the thighs and back up again. Slide them down the thighs and back up again. Slide them down the thighs and back up again, okay? When you're doing it like this, you've got control. The additional benefit of having the double underhand grip is that, again, much like with the band earlier on and the goblet hold, you are going to be weaker holding onto the bar. So it's more likely that your hands give out before your back does. Another strategy in helping make sure that you don't progress too quickly. These last two levels of the hip hinge are really where we're transitioning into what's more a conventional deadlift, and the very last one we'll be talking about a sumo style deadlift or a wider stance deadlift. When we're doing this movement, I've set it up on the rack. This is the rack pull variation. And I've got these little elevated platforms here because in your gym, you'll probably be able to use a slightly lower setting. We're slightly limited with the squat rack here. But generally speaking, you've got the lowest level on the squat rack or the power rack, which allows you to put the safety bars in. And this allows us to basically do a deadlift or a hip hinge or a wide stance deadlift in a position that isn't quite from the floor. It's like a halfway house between the hip hinge, where we might not be touching the floor, and getting into the deadlift, but doing it in a slightly safer way. And whenever we're transitioning from the weights that we've been using over there, dumbbells, kettlebells, etc., over to barbells, and there's a little bit of a difference in technique, always slightly lower the weights that you're using. It just makes sense for a couple of sessions just to get comfortable with the technique again. We want to make sure that we're not making any technical errors when we're doing this. But just like before, I've set up the barbell already. I haven't done it on the floor, and I'm going to get into position. And I'm going to be doing, again, both double underhanded grips here, holding on in the nice position, bracing myself nice and well, and then coming up to the top position, and then slowly lowering back down. It's going to kiss the rack, and then coming up to the top position, slowly lowering back down, and then coming up to the top position, and slowly lowering back down. And this is no different fundamentally to the deadlift. It's only that we're allowing ourselves to go a little bit lower. And you might start with a slightly higher baseline level and then drop it down and down and down. In some of the gyms that you'll go to, you'll have blocks where you can elevate the bar itself. So you're not doing this in a power rack like I'm doing, you're doing it over in the deadlift station, but you've elevated the bar so it's a little bit easier. At the extreme, others will do what's called a deficit deadlift, where they elevate themselves so they have to go even lower. But that's something perhaps for another day. The final step, of course, is going to be the proper deadlift. And when you're starting out, you want to perhaps do a couple of warm-up sets in the rack itself, where you've set it up on the rack. You then pick the weight up safely, of course, come out, and then engage in doing the actual deadlift itself by coming all the way down to the floor and back up again, all the way down to the floor and back up again. Or if you're doing a wider stance, we'll pop it down, get ourselves a little bit wider. With the wider stance, you generally have to go double over. So it's something that I would suggest is more advanced. And you come down, over like so, and drive up and down and up and down and up and down and up. Always getting that chest pop at the end, not arching backwards, but just the chest pop and then back down like so. Ultimately with the hip hinge, it doesn't matter where you're starting. You start where you start, whatever the tolerance is, whatever your competence is, and then you move forwards. You're ideally aiming to be able to do 3 sets of 10 reps, maybe even 4 or 5 sets of that 10 reps. You might rest for 30 to 60 seconds between each, and steadily over time, you'll experiment with the next difficulty. You can feed this in at the end as the last set, trying the newest intensity, maybe moving from body weight to the bands, or you can just try one day where you just get the band out for the first time and try and do all 5 sets with the band. Understand that you stop when you start to get some aggravation. You debrief, you figure out what happened. Was it that I lost form? Was it that I just got fatigued and that's all I can do for the time being? There's no shame in doing something like 10, 10, 10, 9, 8. In terms of the reps that you're doing on each one. You don't have to get 10 reps one way or the other. You can just do 7 if that's all you could do competently. And ideally, as you're progressing your rehab, certainly in the later stages, you should find you are fatiguing. You're actually working out hard on these workouts, and maybe you can't do 10 reps in the last couple of sets. And that's a good indication that you're working out at the right level. This is the kind of stuff that we help members of the program with in phase 4 of the Back in Shape program. Long story short, if you use the hip hinge in combination with the other another of the 5 core exercises for spine health that we recently did on a full podcast, link down in the description, you will be able to leverage the skill and competence in the early days that you gain to help reduce the flare-ups that you're having on a daily basis, to allow you to return to doing the things that you couldn't do before in daily life, and then later on literally build back strength into your lumbar spine and the tissues that have been damaged, alongside the muscles that surround and extend down into the legs and up into the middle and upper back, to rebuild a strong and healthy body in the most complete sense. As you're progressing, you will find that if you're doing it thoughtfully, you will improve the range of motion in those hips, and that further will benefit your health and well-being and the resilience in your lumbar spine. But you will also be building strength alongside that flexibility, which is a massive, important factor to take note of, as too many people focus mindlessly on stretching, especially in the early days, because they think it's the right thing to do. And we've got other videos that explore this in much more detail to help you understand why that is such a mistake. Hopefully you have found this video helpful. You understood a pathway to leverage this exercise into doing exercises like deadlift again in the future. The simple reality is all of you watching this at some point are going to have to lift things off the floor. And often we just don't think about those things when we're evaluating our back. We're so worried about it that we think I could never possibly do that. But the reality is, it's been proven in time and time again with patients and members that you do these things. You go, oh gosh, I can't believe I actually did that. It's a shock. I decided to lift a tumble dryer, or I decided to lift that bag of compost down to the bottom of the garden, or my grandchildren came over and I picked up the little one because he just needed a bit of care, or my children, I pick them up because they're small, they're toddlers, they're maybe newborn babies, and I'm lifting them up in spite of the bad back. And when you start to think about these sorts of things, you realize there is no way to avoid lifting in the real world. And deadlifts don't have to be a terrible exercise, but unfortunately too many people don't get the instruction, the education, the training on how to perform these safely and effectively. They go a bit too gung-ho and they end up injuring themselves and think, I shouldn't do that, it's bad for your back. It's not bad for your back if it's done correctly. You build correct form and you're not silly with these things. And silly is not a functional weight. Silly is the attitude and way in which you approach these things. And if you do the sorts of things with the sorts of attitudes that we've discussed in this video and our others, you're going to find that you rebuild health and resilience back into your lumbar spine, no matter how bad it is. Because we've seen people in the membership and patients over the years with all manner of back injuries, back diagnoses, surgery, not surgery, spondylolisthesis, herniated discs, the list goes on. And they can all get better if they just give it the time, the progress through those exercises. You'll find that there's not one of those scenarios where we can't make substantial improvements in our health and well-being and get back to doing things that we previously thought were off the cards for us for good. Hopefully you found this video helpful. Remember, there are tons of resources linked down in the description. You've also got the membership that can help you if you need a little bit more support in recovering from your herniated disc or other back-related injury. And also, if you know someone else that's been struggling, they've been going around in circles, they're not getting luck with their back, consider sharing this video with them, because it really will hopefully flip a switch in their approach and make them start to do the sorts of things that are proven to rebuild back health again. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.